Hello everyone, today we talk about the Earldom of Ulster, an Anglo-Norman lordship in northeastern Ireland during the Middle Ages, from 1177, its foundation to its annexation to the English crown in 1461. The Earls of Ulster ruled the land as a broader part of the Lordship of Ireland, about which I made a video recently that can serve a bit as a background, as an introduction to these other smaller polities. Crucial, as we will see, to the earldom's history was the Norman knight Jean de Courcy, who not only founded this territory but essentially built it up as at some point the most successful Irish lordship. Jean invaded the Gaelic Irish kingdom of Uled in 1177 and conquered most of the territory, would be part, in fact, of the earldom over the following few years. Right, in 1181 he was conferred the title of Earl Palatine of Ulster by the King Henry II of England. The earldom was definitely, already at this point, the most important Anglo-Norman lordship in the north of Ireland. It covered, in fact, most of what are now the Ulster counties of Antrim and Down, and briefly extended west to Lough Foyle. Right, its capital, or at least its most important center from which the earls ruled, was the massive Carrickfergus castle. The coastal dimension of the earldom is quite important because of the same dynamics we find mostly in the rest of Anglo-Norman Ireland. That is the supplies that had to come from Britain, right, favoring, supporting the colonization with the settlers, with various resources, and so on. And as we will see, even though the boundaries of the earldom floated, at least in practice, a big deal, especially in the later Middle Ages, still these, the aforementioned ones remained the most important centers. The earldom basically grew to be the most powerful territorial unit in Anglo-Norman Ireland by the end of the 13th century, right? And this tells you really a lot about how it was administered, and considering it was also relatively contained extensionally. The end of the 13th century is basically the peak of the great medieval civilization. So, as we have seen in basically in all these historical region series videos, from the mid-14th century onward, you witness instead a decline. In this case, a quite consistent one. The earldom suffered a dramatic reduction in its territorial extent. The original Anglo-Norman settlers became increasingly Gaelicized and lost virtually all contact, even with the central government in Dublin. You can imagine the one of London. By the Bruce campaign in Ireland in the 10s of the 14th century, the land never really recovered from this quite messy situation in which the same earls basically lost virtually their autonomy, but not their independence in a sense, because, as we have seen, they were quite decentralized. But the system had gotten, say, bigger in scale, also for all these lands' history to be deeply intertwined. We'll see it now, even just in terms of feudal dynastic connections. By the 15th century, the earldom was restricted to essentially only the coastal enclaves in County Down and around Carrickfergus, while the title of Ulster passed, as we were saying before, to the Crown of England in 1461. which doesn't mean that Ulster was essentially controlled by the English at that point. Actually, it will not be from quite for quite some time. So let's start mostly with Jean de Courcy's exploit, which are really impressive, right? And that the earldom owes basically most of its existence to. In 1175, after a period of fighting between the Normans and the Irish, the High King of the latter, Rory O'Connor, sued for peace with King Henry II of England, who essentially agreed to a status quo, allowing the Normans to consolidate their conquests in return for no more incursions into Gaelic territory. Naturally, this was just an ideal settlement between the major authorities of the respective countries, but the reality on the ground was quite different because, albeit the previous years of war had exhausted both contenders, at least to the degree of accepting this situation, at least not keeping to fight in the same scale, raids, colonization, and resistance to that, respectively, from the English and the Irish side, continued consistently, with an incredible level of violence. By the way, as you know, this context is marked by the ambition of individual rulers, such as the Courcy, to extend their power on a land that was sort of a far west, right? Differently from the Baltic Crusades, Ireland was already Christianized. So the colonizers, let's say, were behaving in a slightly different way, but it not necessarily for the degree of violence, as we will see now. And their goal being, as we said, essentially carving a seigneury for themselves in this world where nobody could quite simply knock at your door and saying, I'm really the overlord here, and you owe me something in the process, but just staying out there on their own as sort of the de facto independent rulers, always, of course, risking, right, living under threat and having to cope with constant guerrilla and rivalry between the other Anglo-Normans, but still with some, say, esprit de corps as far as even the English monarchic demands were, because even though there wasn't much of a sense of cohesion or between the Anglo-Normans and the Irish themselves, and of course there is a deep intersection between all these political and military between them, as far as the political and military history is concerned. Still, the Anglo-Irish, let's say, formed like a front that could negotiate, still in part, their autonomy with London. As a consequence, Henry's Norman vassals remained fundamentally restless. The Irish were more primitive. They had already been dealing with foreign invaders, conquerors, settlers from quite a long time. You can't quite even draw a neat line between the Hiberno-Norse period and the Anglo-Norman one, as it had always been about the coastal centers, the ones that had been previously inhabited by the Gaels, but that especially the Vikings entrenched in and fortified, and as you know, the major Irish cities still today, essentially dating back then, and being the same places where the English settled as well, mostly from the east, again, with mostly the bulwark of Dublin, from which, again, the Gaels could not really dislodge the invaders, and given that most of the island was covered in forests, in impenetrable terrain, at least very difficult one on the base of which to centralize, at least they could carry out this relentless attrition. that unavoidably, as all warfare brings to a degree of hybrid, and in fact, at this point, we see also the Irish chieftains essentially starting to, and I made multiple videos about, especially their warfare, displaying this phenomenon, like looking ever more similar to the English. Also because, of course, arms and armor were pretty much the same. Ireland had been particularly backwards, as you know, in terms of military culture in general, and people like to exaggerate the technological gap, but they always ignored the doctrinal standard and the context in the first place. Like the Anglo-Normans didn't conquer Ireland because of technology. They conquered because we're more politically compact and a more advanced civilization. That's it, right? And that does not include. I mean, how do you think an Irish warrior fought? Right? Mostly, yes, they were poorer and living in the wild, having a traditionally a scarcity of armor, of cavalry, and so on. But their leaders fought still exactly like an Englishman could do, if not actually with a greater individual superiority, greater poverty still. But the model throughout which the entire European knighthood developed was the same identical one, right? As I countless explained. So no, it's not having, I don't know, what is technology in this regard. It's having the resources, having the morally and materially alike. And you can't help but seeing how politically fragmented the Gaels themselves were against the invader, because simply, again, they didn't have other means to consolidate. They didn't have enough surplus to consolidate, right? Something more politically cohesive, right? They mostly also were fighting against each other throughout all this. And in fact, it happened often that there were groups, leagues, alliances of Anglo-Normans that essentially were supported by different groups of Irish that had something to gain also by siding for one or the other. The history of Jean de Courcy is fascinating. He was born in Kent around the mid-12th century. Had French roots, important connections in northwestern England that will be particularly useful for his Irish adventure. He was not enormously powerful, and this is what made many of these leaders, in fact, hungry and ambitious enough, right, to gap that, let's say, distance from the top. In 1176, Jean came to Ireland spontaneously, right? He wasn't really called by anyone, right? And he hadn't received even the green light from Henry II. So it's, again, this, say, Irish far west where you can't really find your own place. We are at the beginning of 1177. And we know that while he was, by the way, in Anglo-Norman controlled parts of Ireland, he carefully planned an invasion of Uled in eastern Ulster that probably he had already been eyeing from his British times. The control of the territory that eventually became the Earldom of Ulster was first won in that same year by Jean from the ancient Macedonian Slavic dynasty of Uled. I will be butchering consistently Gaelic phonetics throughout the video, and you will hopefully forgive me. De Courcy's conquest, which roughly comprised the modern counties Down and Antrim, was consolidated with the settlement from England. Of course, notably from Cumbria, right, that is just essentially not even 100 kilometers away across the Irish Sea, where the Courcy, as we were saying before, had family connections. Right, this phenomenon was quite important because we're in the 12th century. All of Europe is growing, right? So there is often a demographic exceedance. There are people that want to occupy new territories, putting them to work, clearing them, deforesting them, and starting to exploit them. And with the, say, from the more advanced, as we've seen, essentially Frankish background compared to the Gaelic one. Naturally, there were some Gaelic followers too, with Jean, that also composed probably the numerical backbone of his forces, right? However, this is how it unfolded, really. Jean obtained the approval of the royal governor in Dublin, which naturally counted something in that context. Dublin was also the easiest access to Ireland as far as the resources, political support, right, could arrive even from across the sea. The Courcy took 32 armored horsemen and around 300 infantry north into Meath. Right, so a very modest force, but this is what you have to expect from the third quarter of 12th century Ireland. Few compact Anglo-Norman plus, of course, Irish elements, forces that under, as we'll see now, a tremendous leadership, want to strike very specific objective and installing themselves as an occupation force. Jean took these forces into Meath because he had obtained the right of passage for Uled troop from its lord de Lacy, that, as we will see, is the house which eventually will deprive the Courcy of the earldom. So there were these neighbors always ready to exploit the situation in a way or another. In this case, kind of expanding, right, the Anglo-Norman boundaries to a sort of end of greater coordination with these forces, stabilizing the land, but at some point also wanting to cash it, right, and to extend their own power in Ireland. Jean then met up with the Irish allies who had been willing to provide men and information for him during the invasion. De Courcy's force then advanced beyond the northern extent of Norman control and into Uled, reaching the petty kingdom of Lachael, having only set out from Dublin 4 days before. Right? Normally, medieval armies marched just like any other, basically 30 kilometers a day, so you understand how accessible these places are. Yet it's not as important how long it takes to invade them, but really what you're able to do once you are there, because again, the local surplus is really scarce, and at least to get enough of it on a land that had, in fact, not known, say, English forces up to that time as Uled, is quite complicated to, in fact, establish a power from. Naturally, Uled had already been roamed by some Norman forces at some point, for sure. Just it had never been directly settled for good, right? So this the Courcy's force was quite even as small, like the most consistent thing that had been seen around by the Giles. So this force advanced on Down Patrick, the chief seat of the Dal Fiatach dynasty, who then ruled Ulaid. Despite the small size of his force, the Kursis' attack caught the Ulaid by surprise, forcing the over-king of the land, Rory mac Donlevy, Ruaidrí mac Duain's Levy, to flee. Interestingly enough, the papal legate, Cardinal Vivian, had been just during that time on a visit to Ulster when the Kursis' attack happened, so that he called for the withdrawal of the Norman forces, a request that went unheeded. The picture is interesting, though, because essentially the Irish here have the support of the Roman Church. As we were saying before, here no one, popes, emperors, kings, whatever, have really an authority. Whoever you are, you're out there on your own, especially when you are in arms, right? And the papal legate has just to observe the conquest taking place. However, there is some spiritual support. As you know, the papacy was essentially almost always opposed to any bloodshed between Christians, and as a whole, for anybody who has studied the actual history of it, it was essentially always telling, don't fight each other, things like that. And the reason in this case being that the ecclesiastical property, as the local administration infrastructure worked from, and that had, as you know, in the island been a multi-century thing, but at that point to have gone on, it would have been damaged significantly in the process. This element, as we will see, however, will also help kind of smoothing the rivalry between the Anglo-Normans and the Irish as well, because as I was saying before, if the Irish had been pagans, like in the Baltic Crusades, things would have really gone differently, and the general posture of the same church or the surrounding Christian policies would have been really different. About a week later, Mac Donlevy returned to Downpatrick with a great host drawn from across Ulaid, with the obvious intent to face the invaders before they could seize too much for the local forces to be practically crippled for good. However, despite being vastly outnumbered, the Kursis' forces won the day. There is no doubt here that, again, there was an Anglo-Norman military superiority of some sort, not by default, otherwise there would have not even been a drop of blood shed. And there were, as we've seen, guiles from the Kursis' side as well, but definitely, right, the Irish didn't have that consistent backbone of heavily armored, intensively as collectively trained shock cavalry, habituated to, again, stick together, almost, glued to one another, smashing, right, with a couche length grip, like into probably the enemy lines. So we can imagine stereotypically something like that, especially for the climatic clash, which naturally also in Gaelic culture had to exemplify, the strategic concept that if you face somebody in open field, you're really, fighting man to man, like, so with more balanced odds. But still, this is ever more relevant. Consider these were people from Uled themselves, so they had all the interest to fight or die in the enterprise. Mac Dunleavy followed up this attack with an even greater force made up of a coalition, this time of Ulster's powers that included the king of the Senel Neogain Mael Sacknail MacLachlan and the chief prelates in the province, supporting the Giles with relics, with chants, with again something similar actually to what the Normans were doing from the other side, pretty standard from the time. This second onslaught is significant because initially the other Ulster's powers had been on the window, watching what was going on and noticing the Uled's forces being crushed so easily, decided to put together an even greater force, which, however, was also defeated by the Normans, who emerged again victorious, even capturing the clergy involved. Included the Archbishop of Armagh, the Bishop of Down, and many of their relics. Right, this was a great win also because their ransom would have allowed the Courcy to establish specific political relation with the Irish. And about the latter, you notice obviously that their constant interwarring, which counts not just for Ulster but for the same Uled, was deleterious to their cause. Right, that was the main problem of Ireland, not inferior technology, if not as a mirror of the lack of political cohesion, right, of broader identitary sense. You know, how, say, theoretical the rule of the High King had historically been in the island, that had never been fully controlled by a single monarch. So the fact that some Gaels continued to be oblivious to the threat of the Normans, even when they bordered their land, shouldn't surprise anyone. Also because their logic was often sound. I mean, there is naturally an upper and lower hand here, but the possibilities that would open during a critical situation like this one were big, right? Not just, say, sometimes the Norman threat was minor compared to the advantage that, for example, the exploiting the weakness of a neighbor, of a Gaelic neighbor that had been in fact damaged by the Normans could represent. De Courcy was very shrewd to take advantage of such instability, and from his base in Downpatrick set about conquering the neighboring districts in Uled. Over the following year, De Courcy, overly eager at this point to extend his conquest, suffered, however, several setbacks as the Irish finally managed to gain some victories. And as we were saying before, the Gaelic interland was a nightmare. We have seen again in the videos about Irish warfare how coordinated they were as far as all these paths hidden in the woods, hit-and-run tactics. Really, I would emphasize run, meaning that they were fast, right? They could attack. Their main problem, they didn't have much to oppose Norman cavalry in open field, so they had to attack quickly, exploiting whichever weakness in preparation of the Normans and the surprise that could be achieved against them, and eventually retreating, dispersing as far as possible. They had all some stations predisposed also with weapons that were even shared among the various chiefdoms, right? And that the Normans, as the major force to control the open ground, wouldn't have much advantage to venture in because, of course, it was the worst ground. And generally speaking, in spite of the sheer brutality of the 12th century, like compared to the Irish, the Normans were not quite habituated to in the same way, if not their, in fact, same Irish auxiliaries. Now, in one instance, the Normans suffered a heavy defeat against the combined forces of MacDonlevy and Maro O'Carroll of Airgialla, which was soon followed up by another defeat further north at the ends of the Wee Twistry and Fairlie, the aftermath of which saw the Anglo-Normans having to fight their way some 30 miles back to the Courcey's castle on foot, outnumbered, and constantly harried by the Gaels. This is fascinating because it shows also operationally what strategic withdrawal was carried out like, right? This is reminiscent of so many other episodes, even against, probably the Gaels did have some cavalry here. The reason why the Anglo-Normans dismounted is that you want to maintain your forces compact, and if you have the lower hand, essentially you have to be on the defensive, and cavalry by definition cannot defend unless dismounting, and that's exactly what would happen, turning to infantry, staying close together. And again, just think again what a retreat for 30 miles across 12th century Northern Ireland could look like. Constant ambushes, savage, because what would happen once you were caught really by the enemy was probably not very nice exactly. The thing was definitely closely fought, but at the same time you realize that the Anglo-Norman forces were not annihilated, so that also the Irish they had to probably manage to reach the enemy's breaking point as far as the offensive was going, so inverting the trend, but it didn't have the shock capacity to crush them along the way, albeit trying. So paths blocked, again, they knew the terrain much better than at least how the Anglo-Normans could operate. Again, surely the auxiliaries knew the terrain fairly well, but that's not exactly the main problem. By the way, not all of Uled had fallen during these fights to the Courcey. For example, the kingdom of Hive Coba, that was situated in central and western County Down, escaped conquest, as did small areas here and there. Again, there would never be in the Earldom of Ulster something like homogeneous, uniform, direct political and military control, right, of every inch of the land. This is not, first of all, a human thing. Not even contemporary states can actually do that virtually, right? Anybody can do really something subversive here and there, but here especially so, because again, most of the, as we'll see also what kind of settlement was taking place here, a deeply militarized one. This is typical of the Celtic fringe, right, with this massive towers and basically no settlement around that, or if so, somewhat contained, because the raids were really, really continuous. So everything looked, aside from the general romantic nature of the landscape, extremely grim, dark, heavy, and bloody. So the Norman and everything was about the terrains, right? So it was not about being everywhere. No force can be everywhere, but at least dissuading someone from trying something foolish. Now the Normans rode through the Eve Cobba on their way from Dublin to Downpatrick, and the nature of their surprise attack suggests that the Eve Cobba had given support to, or at least assented to, de Courcy's plan. So yet another a Gaelic polity that basically negotiated with the invaders, getting surely something in exchange in the process. Subsequently, the Magennis clan that ruled Eve Cobba profited, in fact, from trading with the Earldom of Ulster. You see how easy it was, in a sense, to buy them, right? And this connection lasted for quite some time, because, as we will see, when the earldom collapsed in 1333, we'll see it after the assassination of the so-called Brown Earl, the Magennis took over part of the earldom's lands to the east, and rebuilt in the process also Magennis Castle, so restoring part of their previous power. MacDonlevy continued to provide instead resistance to the Courcy, but the picture there was different. The Ulaid had been lost fundamentally, and with it the balance of power in Ulster shifted. De Courcy's Signory now was again the most powerful entity around. The success of the invasion and the ability to withstand the counterattacks despite facing overwhelming odds essentially bowed just the great part of that deterrent that we were talking about before. This was the moment of greatest testing, and the Norman political and military superiority over the Irish was established in that province. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the Earldom of Ulster was the massive work of encapsulation that de Courcy carried out throughout his rule. Right, something really incredible if you consider just the general surplus of the land. We have discovered at least 128 moats in Ulster, right? The majority of which can be found in the area of greatest Norman presence. That is South County Antrim and North County Down. If you consider what this means, it's not just the material, but the garrisons that you have to live in them, otherwise the fortification is completely useless, you realize the incredible effort carried out here by the Anglo-Normans. It's possible that de Courcy had tasted the bitter Gaelic resistance and counteroffensive capabilities to find the moral and material energies to convince even his subjects to just participate in this massive work of encapsulation. Naturally, not all these moats were built in his time, but overall, right, we're talking about at least, castles that had been erected also in previous Gaelic fortifications. Again, in medieval Europe, it's completely normal in spaces of just hundreds of square kilometers to have literally hundreds of castles, right? But again, in the north of Ireland in the 12th century, just this concentration around these areas is really above the norm, or at least some. Of course, the castles were not, as we'll see now, massive fortifications. Mostly Carrickfergus was really important, and also some others, but most of them were, in fact, minor stuff that we can at best track archaeologically, because again, there wouldn't be otherwise no other trace or memory of them, right? But it's really something. Besides Carrickfergus Castle, de Courcy built the one of Rath, now known as Dundrum Castle, which stood guard over Lackhead as our important center. So what you notice also in the distribution of these fortresses and the general extension of the Earldom of Ulster is that all the conquests made by de Courcy had quick and easy access to the sea. Right, this was the actual lifeline for the earldom when, for example, new forces were needed, because also some of the occupants would at some point come back to England. But the earldom at this point, it is not yet such, because it had still to be conferred as such by Henry II, but let's call it this way still, was rising to broader scale preeminence in the region, also across the sea. In fact, the Irish Sea had not really been controlled now entirely by the Anglo-Normans. The Norse, for example, were still around. And de Courcy played very much initially on this kind of, say, the centralization, right, from the Kingdom of England, allying himself with his other actors. For example, in 1180, he married Africa, the daughter of Gudrud Olafsson, King of the Isles, which at that point ruled also from the Isle of Man, that is just next door from Ulster. And this allowed de Courcy to call upon also a strong fleet, further reinforcing his position. Right, the Kingdom of the Isles, I made a video on, just from terms of naval potential. It was about its army organization, so we'll talk about it in this kind of historical region series at some point soon, hopefully. But as you know, it was basically, as the name says, like a seaborne coastal reality controlling essentially a wide set of islands, from the Hebrides to the Orkneys to the Isle of Man, etc., to the other islands around the Scottish coast, etc. And it basically depended on the Kingdom of Norway, at least as a broader, as the other major naval power around. And this force was fundamentally and historically distant, right, from whoever was ruling from southern England, because that had represented basically the most centralized, developed kind of reality. The Anglo-Saxons had always countered this coalition, basically, at least of northerners, including same northern Anglo-Saxons mixed with partly with the Danes, thinking about Northumbria, but in fact counting the same Irish, the Scots, etc. So for de Courcy to settle in Ulster, as we've seen, but without any English monarchic permission per se, was to enter a bit that circuit as well. Everything is much more nuanced, that there weren't two blocks that you can rigidly draw simply like this, but tendentially there was at least a tension between the two directions. The same Uled inhabitants had to come to terms with the fact that the Normans were there to stay now, as much as even siding with them, given that they had started being under a substantial amount of raids and attacks from the northern O'Neill at this point, which, as we were saying before, was the consequence again of those were lost basically, so the O'Neill preferred to simply, eat their relics, right, and grow stronger on their own account with this entity now that they found just next door. It was quite a threat. An example is the one of 1182, when there was an alliance between the Courcy and the Ouled that managed to defeat an incursion of the Audoblin sept of the northern O'Neill, which tells you also how autonomous within this broader, say, polities certain groups within really were. It was all about military retinues. We will see now about the Bond Act and how much the actual Irish policy depended on, again, rendering military service to this or that lord, right, with this still kind of war-bound, heroic mentality. According to the Annals of the Four Masters, quote, in 1182, Domhnall mac Halda mac Loughlane of the Northern O'Neill took an army to Dunboy in Fair and Cryhope, eastern County Londonderry, to fight the foreigners. However, they were defeated with many Gaelic nobles killed. Right? We cannot stress the traumatic level of brutality present in Irish warfare. Again, I made multiple videos on this, on broader Gaelic warfare, also in Scotland and so on, and how, say, late in time, this literal, say, going in front of the person and starting to cut them to pieces, right, where they actually keep fighting, cutting you to pieces as well, is basically the norm of this. It is practically the only horizon that exists in the head of these people. So that's the, that tells you again why and how this era was so turbulent, fragmented, fortified, and generally speaking, underdeveloped. So having committed crimes against the church and its servants, as we were saying before, during his conquest of Uled, the Courcy saw fit to normalize the relations with the local church, especially given that, as we've seen, there was no essentially religious divide here of any sort, and that, on the contrary, was now the more advanced Anglo-Norman lordship that required, to like a firmer footing in the land, encompassing the same church. So what does the Courcy do? He makes amend, in part, by granting land to the same local church, establishing abbeys. So also in the eyes of the papacy, like showing that by now he was the more reliable force locally, and that, so that's also the most preferred one to co-opt in case some greater power had to step into Ireland, such as the King of England, as we will see now, in fact, happening. The Courcy also renamed Dunda Letglas Downpatrick after Saint Patrick, right, and granted it to the church as such, and having the alleged remains of Saint Patrick, Bridget, and Colmcille allegedly transferred there. So again, playing also on the local spiritual identity, Christian faith, and so on. As, look, this ruler is after all aggrandizing our place, making it also a bigger one than before, and so on. So the Courcy's rule continued for a substantially long time there, some 25 years or so, during which he basically lived for what he had been fighting there all the time, being an independent king. Again, an Anglo-Norman lord in Ireland, basically unchallenged, aside from these kind guerrilla and so on, but still living as a prince, so much so that he styled himself Princeps Ultonie, so the ruler of Ulster. That's how he called us Ultonia, right? De Courcy administered his own justice, and even minted his own halfpennies and fair things, which again tells you how concentrated his power was in his hands. Again, there was no really solid feudal hierarchy there. He had all the administrative measures taken by himself and supervising them, being on the ground and so on. De Courcy was also described at this point as Prince of the Ulster people, and his arrest warrant was called, now we'll see it by John, King of England, quote, King of all the barons of Ulster, referring to all the local chieftains and, in fact, proper Anglo-Norman knights that had been serving him there. In 1197, Jean de Courcy's brother, Jourdan, was killed by one of his Gaelic attendants, showing also, of course, how bitter really was the Irish acceptance of this situation. As a revenge, Jean attacked various Gaelic petty kings. The repression was brutal. Right. In this, he was aided by Duncan, Earl of Carrick, who was the cousin of his wife Africa. Jean led also his army across the River Bann at Eas Creep, the Salmon Leap, in modern-day Coleraine, County Londonderry, in Fir na Craiobe, where they founded the castle of Kilsanctan. Then Jean led west to the neighboring territory of Kinachta. From the castle in Kilsanctan, Russell Peyton, who had been left in charge of a large force, set forth to plunder the surrounding territories and churches, going as far as the harbor of Derry. Consider the moral background of the context, right? This lord, whose name rings, as we've seen, far and wide in the areas, had his brother assassinated by these Gaelic resistance, and he's really setting on fire, destroying, raping, massacring. So from the other side, the Irish react as well. In fact, the Northern O'Neill king, Flyther Bach o Mael Diora, that is Flaherty of Maldory in English version of the Channel Coinel, took a force and engaged Python on the strand of the Fogan Bay, resulting in a slaughter of the English, as well as the death of the son of Artgal MacLachlan, that was of the ruling dynasty of the Kenel Neogain, rivals of the Kenel Conain, and that, to make the long story short, was on the side of the English. So again, the partisan decision here of siding the Anglo-Normans, or essentially fueling another powerful clan, right, that may have been your enemy even before the English arrived, meant really a lot. So it's really a feud, a vendetta, constant a revenge plot, conspiracy against one another, resulting in these brutal outcomes. Now, as reward for his help, Duncan was rewarded a sizable portion of the territory subjugated from the Giles by de Courcy. This part would be essentially along the northern coastline of present-day counties Antrim and London. There, it had a strategic significance. So again, the support that also arrived from the sea, from essentially these Norse leaders, married into the Anglo-Norman house here, allowed, in fact, the same Norse to consolidate more power in the region too for themselves. From the death of Murtagh MacLachlan, let's use just the English transliteration, King of the Senil Noagan over King of Northern O'Neill, as well as High King of Ireland in 1166, the Northern O'Neill had been ruled by the Flaithbertach O'Mail Dore of the Kenil Connail. During the same time, the Kenil Nelgain had 8 kings, all of which had died violently, either in conflict with the Kenil Connail or amongst themselves. Adding to the mix was the ascendancy of the O'Neill sept of the kingship of Kenil Nelgain in place of the MacLachlans. Now, upon the death of Flaithbertach O'Mail Dore in 1197, Ecmarc Doherty of the Kenil Connail ascended to the kingship of the Kenil Cornail and Northern O'Neill. And with the death of O'Mail Dore, de Courcy launched an expedition to Derry. Exploiting the political weakness, he camped there for 5 nights, which was a way to prove also the control of the field. While Dochertag attacked de Courcy, however, and was killed in the process. His force defeated. The Anglo-Normans at that point plundered all the cattle from the Inishoven Peninsula, so proving that all the Gaelic machinations against the earldom were practically useless, that de Courcy had the upper hand. 2 years later, in 1199, de Courcy returned to Derry. He plundered the surrounding countryside for a considerable amount of time, until Haid O'Neill of the Kenil Nelgain led a counterattack by sea, by the way, at Larne in de Courcy's own territory. Striking back, the Gaels had been engaged in, of course, also in maritime operations throughout this whole time, even though they mostly were terrestrial power, and these forces were mostly, again, amphibious, like just to surprise now those lands that in fact normally were thought to be if not impregnable from seaborne raids, but at least, somewhat effectively defended, also because of the Norse support and so on. In 1200 and 1204, de Courcy retaliated by launching raids into the Kenil Nelgain's territory, that is, Tir Elgain. However, these were futile, right? And this was also the last battle in which Dermot MacLachlan led his troops falling in combat. It's also evident that de Courcy was aiding MacLachlan in his claim to the kingship of Kenil Nelgain, and as such received their aid in attacking their principal rivals and enemies that were, in fact, the O'Neills and the Kenil Connail. De Courcy ruled Ulster throughout all this time as we said, with exceptional independence. Until in 1205 he was expelled by the earldom by Hugh II de Lacy, Lord of Meath, that, as we've seen, had bordered the Earldom of Ulster. De Lacy in this was sponsored and rewarded by King John, that had been ruling Ireland in his youth and had essentially observed the incredible, in fact, independence enjoyed by de Courcys, whose lands were given, in fact, to de Lacy. It's fair to say that only at this point the earldom, as far as the fief as such, is established as properly a colony, right? At least the first moment in which an English king interferes directly, or at least by proxy, like sponsoring de Lacy for the destruction of this to independent ruler. That was technically owing the same English crown, the governor in Dublin, some forces, and that was acting instead in a very independent way, also interfering with broader policies in the Irish Sea, as we have seen, siding with essentially the Norse controlling the Isle of Man, that was still an important avampost of the Norse, essentially close to English interest, as a wedge that was not to go away. The unreliability of these Anglo-Irish vassals brought the same King John to expel de Lacy in turn during the king's expedition to Ireland in 1210. The reason being a bit the same. De Lacy had been associating with John's enemies, and for this reason was also not really providing the monarch with the aid, the support who was required. De Lacy would not be restored until in the 20s of the 13th century. He resorted to open war with the government. Once again. In 1227, however, he was recognized as Earl of Ulster for life. That he remained, in fact, until his death in 1242. After which, technically, the earldom reverted to the crown. Again, this is all nominal. Nobody could really simply step in there and taking control of the situation per se. It was full of other Anglo-Irish noblemen that wanted to take control, and so the thing is more complicated than this. In the meanwhile, the earldom had been developing further. There were now essentially 5 administrative provinces that had outlined themselves: Down, Antrim, Carrickfergus, Newton, Blythwick, that is Newton, Nairns, and Coleraine. These were just centers in their own regard, right? What lay in between them was exactly not always the same, meaning that the boundaries fluctuated periodically because of all these turmoils. In any case, the earldom was so well established that these centers were capable of defending themselves, also thanks to the aforementioned net of moats that covered the entire territory. As we were saying before, there hadn't been much of a, say, even speaking of urban development is exaggerated per se. Here we're looking at, especially for the fortifications, at just some dull towers, right? Massive fortifications, really, that stored supplies, hosted a garrison, had just to basically be a pain in the behind for anyone who wanted to get them passed by, because they were very difficult to storm while carrying out this raid, and so being exposed to eventual counterattacks, counter raids, sorties, etc. So the bailey was normally not there with the motte, and you really have this wild landscape dotted with fortresses more or less were connected with one another, could signal each other to the enemy movements, and that, however, risked themselves to be stormed if enough force was concentrated. In any case, this protective system was largely successful, right? Plus, as we've said, there were bigger fortresses such as the castles of Dundrum, Green Castle, and County Down, and Coleraine. The impressive fortress at Carrickfergus was developed further. It was properly a royal castle that also in later times, in spite of all the troubles, remained garrisoned always by a sort of central government, whoever was ruling there, and in theory connected with, ultimately with Dublin, with London. Ulster, because of the general autonomy, again, the de facto situation that had formed in Ireland, had also managed to institutionalize with the English monarch its own liberty of jurisdiction. That is to say, the earls ruled independently of the crown, and as such kept also separate administrative records, right? When I say independent, it's never so from a formal point of view. There were also minor exceptions, probably of direct royal intervention. But the administration of the land was unavoidably connected with a decentralized government, and that had to just work on its own without essentially asking permission of what to do for the overwhelming majority of measures that they had to take. Now, the problem is, given the fact that the Ulster records were stolen from Trim Castle in the 90s of the 15th century, and consequently lost, we know a very little about what the Earldom of Ulster administration was about. This is a pity for two reasons. First of all, because of the actual loss. I mean, the Ulster, as we've seen, was ruled by, after all, a functional apparatus, right? At least all these garrisons that were paid, there was some central direction, right? So it would have been interesting to document in the first place. The other is historiographical, because the fact that the records were the record disappeared. Even the historians of the Irish lordship remain generally uninterested in the Earldom of Ulster's government, and so, but with the Earldom of Ulster in general, right? The only exception to this lack of documentation are the royal records that were preserved for those only, unfortunately, for those periods when the earldom lapsed or the earl was a minor. So just if also there was an adequate control, and naturally we're lucky that the documents were preserved or just were drafted, because that may have been an actual problem, that we can have a glimpse of what the Ulster's government really was about. This land nominally remained in the king's hands from the death of the lessee in 1242 until 21 years later, the earldom was granted to the Lord of Connacht, that is Walter de Burgh. Walter died in 1271, and his successor was a minor, Richard de Burgh, known as the Red Earl. Right, Richard gained control of Ulster in 1281. He was still quite young, and in spite of this temporary troubles during his tenure, the earldom reached the apogee of its prosperity, right? Territorial extent, influence, etc. Again, we're at the end of the 13th century. This was, after all, a compact power. It still retained, again, in the very northeast of the island, this important connections with Scotland and England. We will see it now. So it had a deep political and strategic relevance. The Red Earl resumed an expansionistic policy. In fact, Richard's control extended west of the river Bann to Derry. The Earl built Northburgh Castle on the Inishowen Peninsula. The Red Earl gained the submission of all the native Ulster lords except the Wa Domhnaill, claiming from them military service, known as the Bonnacht of Ulster, from the Gaelic Buana, which means hired soldier. The Bonnachts will be, a famous, object of content between all, in fact, aimed at controlling the earldom. I made a video about late medieval and early modern European mercenarism. We know, generally speaking, of the Gaelic soldiers, mercenaries, that could be found plenty of in this region. It would serve abroad even at some point. Again, people that had basically, if not nothing, at least very few to lose, and that, as we've seen, given the general turbulence of the land, were habituated to this kind of lifestyle. This is important because we are also in a time in history in which mercenarism becomes ever more professional. Right here, we are switching from the tribal war bands, especially in Ireland, to the private companies, right, of the late Middle Ages. Essentially, the Bonnachts represent the low, essentially the subject's tribute to the Earl. Right, so it's a sort of feudal system, like in the other lands of Europe, except with a bit more of a Gaelic, brutality flavor added to that, and also in this kind of unruly way for which the allegiance of these war bands was really, floating. Let's put it in this way. In any case, given that the Red Earl was successful, these troops also served more eagerly. The career of Richard of Ulster illustrates how the land, far from being a peripheral region, was part of this broader political world connected through the Irish Sea. The Courcy had essentially started this by colonizing Ulster from the north of England and consolidating this power, exploiting again essentially the weakness of the monarchy, the English monarchy, and this frontier area, right, that could hardly be reached, and also was one of the least appealing in the first place for the English. But things were stepping up, as we'll see now, to a higher level, right? Because the kingdom was of England, especially after the loss of the major French possessions at the beginning of the 13th century, was consolidating ever more kind of a British dimension of rule that would naturally touch on the same Ireland. Following de Lacy's forfeiture in 1210, large tracts of the Earldom of Ulster coastline were granted to the Scottish Earls of Atholl, Carrick, and the Lord of Galway. But in insight, the most important policy carried out under Richard the Burr was the siding with Edward I of England. In fact, the Red Earl helped the Plantagenet king to recover the Isle of Man. Troops from Ulster essentially participated in this military expedition in 1290. It also served under the Hammer of the Scots in Scotland in 1296 and 1303. Right, so interestingly enough, imagine the English army that surely contained, as you know, about Balliol and more Scottish elements. However, was of course reinforced by Anglo-Norman lords from Ireland with Gaelic troops. The Red Earl was also linked by marriage to the Bruces, that, as you know, would become kings of Scotland, were heavily involved, in fact, in what was happening during the English invasion in Scotland from their northern establishment. At that point, they were still Earls of Carrick, but they had already spotted in Ulster a strategic land to marry in the rulers of in function of a Scottish monarchic policy, right? In fact, such a dynastic connection would not be forgotten when between 1315 and 18 Ulster became the base for Edward Bruce's attempt to claim the kingship of Ireland. As you know, pretty messed up contest winning. Basically, the Scots invaded Ireland trying to dislodge the English. It was actually a failure. But as far as the Earldom of Ulster was involved, also a disaster for the same allies there, because this, again, northeasternmost almost bridge, right, with Scotland of Ireland was devastated by the expedition, by the war that followed. These were tough times. Medieval civilization was starting already to exhaust itself because of all these wars, famines, etc. And Ulster suffered heavily. And the local earls were basically powerless. At that point, just the Bruce controlled the operations there. He had the greater amount of force, and the earls were recognized, but not that they had de facto not the direct control, even just on their own territory. When in 1328 Richard the Burr's grandson William the Brown Earl attempted to retake control of his earldom, which throughout these years had been and the thing had not been over with the 10s of the 14th century. Right after the death of his grandfather in 1326, there had been further clashes for the earldom. He was, however, supported by an now ailing King Robert Bruce of Scotland. That was, by the way, William's cousin, because Richard's daughter had been married to the Scottish king, Robert's father. So they shared more than much in their essentially quest, at least for autonomization of Ireland from England. By this point, Scotland had backed down. There would be, as you know, other wars. Edward III would invade Scotland again. There were, let's say, at this point, enough reasons for not just not intervening in Ireland, like it had occurred essentially just after the Scottish victory over the English at Bannockburn, but there was just a greater contraction of all these polities, territorial control. The crisis had kicked in, and the decline was starting being felt in the previously well-balanced Earldom of Ulster as well. After the Bruce's invasion, the next most destructive thing for the land was essentially political in nature. The assassination of William the Brown Earl in 1333 at the hands of his own vassals that were exploiting the weakness of the earldom to definitely destabilize central power. As a consequence, also from a formal point of view, after the Brown Earl, there were other rulers, but in the immediacy, mostly absentees, right? The earldom descended by marriage to Lionel of Clarence, then to the Mortimer Earls of Mark, that would be trying to gain control if it wasn't for often their premature deaths. Without the influence of a strong central figure, the control of Ulster passed to the aforementioned war bands, Gaelic and Gaelic Irish and mercenary Scots, chiefly the Clanboy O'Neills and the MacDonalds of the Glens of Antrim. Naturally, not managing really to detain a unitary control on the land and constantly fighting against each other. What happened to the most important centers at this point was their enclosure, right? The majority, say, of the earldoms houses were pushed into South County Down and the Ards Peninsula. These families also became increasingly Gaelic in customs. This had already been going on from quite a while, arguably, since the Anglo-Norman settlement. Of course, since the Courcys times, there had been, for example, a veneration for Irish saints. As we've seen, native Ulster lords had been associating themselves with the earls, requiring their military support against other Gaelic powers, or other Anglo-Norman ones for that matter. Consider that at the death of the Red Earl in 1326, the local Giles wrote a poem in praise of him. Naturally, these were local supporters. But again, here we are in the typically medieval traditional mentality, for which the land and the people are basically there, and whoever rules on them is just a guide that has been chosen, right, to do so in respect, in theory at least, of the local customs and such. Surely the Anglo-Norman one had been a brutal colonization by some degree, but you cannot unsee, of course, the fact that they, the local lords had become Irish, as far as at least the geography of the situation kind of in great part determined them to be. And the same culture of the invaders affected the locals in the other direction, right? For example, many of the O'Neills of Clandeboy began to call themselves Henry, right, as a typically English name. The reason, of course, wanting to be co-opted by the earls, kind of sharing the culture of the leaders just as a matter of status, right? Being, again, part of the elite, and just because, of course, that model was more useful for any Gaelic lord to aggrandize himself and to enter, again, the bigger game in the match. Nor the Earldom of Ulster collapsed, even as a functional government, at the assassination of William the Burr in 1333. If anything, there was just a contraction that is, as we've seen, typical mostly of medieval Europe at this point. All great powers had been florid, expanding, conquering, whatever, at some point contract because all of a sudden demographic and agricultural resources disappear in great number, and they literally have less reach, less, again, forces to deter. So all what we said before, so it was a natural as gradual process, also not necessarily caused by violent destruction for that matter. That existed, but it was just one of the things. Plus, the earldom was still providing revenue to the royal representatives in Dublin. Right, there were the Savage, right, a dynasty that managed to inherit the role of seneschal of the earldom that in the 50s of the 14th century that essentially kept things working by some degree, sharing power with other figures. Moreover, there was always a recognition that the aforementioned bonnets of Ulster were to be provided to whomever the Earl of the land was. This was asked sometimes even by the same Dublin, right? So whoever had was nominally appointed, right, to as Earl, or even if he was ruling from somewhere else of Ulster, could require the distances, as we've seen, are short, generally speaking, those war bands to render the service owed to the earldom. Mostly the O'Neills at this point had hijacked the war bands of Ulster altogether, so including the earldom, Olid, and so on. But it was not just in bad fate that such Gaelic war bands and their chief could not serve the earldom at a point. In fact, speaking of the Mortimer Earls, both the 6th and the 8th, respectively, in 1381 and 1425, died within 2 years of their first successes, at least installment or at least interference in Ulster, so that they couldn't quite just even when managing to summon these warbands to use them to full or practical effect, right? And it wasn't that easy as just, I don't know, arriving at Carrickfergus Castle and, let's say, claiming, okay, I need these troops and these would flock to you. In part, it would happen, it would be other followers, right? Whomever you were, in order to control significant parts of the land, or even just managing to require the subjects to comply, would have meant that you were quite attractive, authoritatively speaking. But again, the hinterland had been substantially detached at this point from the main centers, and so if you wanted to retake control of that, you must have had, if anything, already your own retinue, as of course this nobleman had, and go out there knocking at these guys' towers, saying, convincing them to align with you. Everything was done much more smoothly, except very often they lacked the measure to even enact it, so it wouldn't happen. In 1425, the aforementioned death of Edmund Mortimer, Ulster passed to Richard, Duke of York. In the same year, this house, as you know, came to the throne of England, and as a consequence, the earldom became a permanent appanage of the English crown. Even this doesn't mean practically much, because the English weren't controlling Ulster. There were naturally characters, figures of some sort, who were operating there on behalf of the English crown, but it's very different from a direct occupation, and Ulster was not really the first concern of the English crown by degree of importance at the time. Nor it was an irrelevant one, because proposals for reconquest of Ulster appear in the sources of the early Tudor era. Just such invasion was not implemented. The English kings cared, however, of course, for all of their domains to be, of course, still connected to them through various media. Right? So much so that this is a little anecdote about Henry VIII, when in 1541 Con Bacach O'Neill suggested to be made Earl of Ulster, because just like the O'Neills were about fundamentally that scale of ambition, and they had been the most important, at least Gaelic rulers in the north. The sovereign Henry VIII strongly rebuffed him, because he said that essentially Ulster was one of the great earldoms of Christendom, as much as an ornament to the English crown, so it could not simply be, surpassed hierarchically by the O'Neill's power as such. It was, again, appanage of the English crown, so that the O'Neills were made only Earls of Tyrone, which was already something, in the northwest mostly. While the English royal claim to Ulster, as a whole, at some point, of course, because the lordship of Ireland was still part of the English dominion, but say specifically the earldom would represent an important factor, at least in the English monarchy policy for a consistent time afterwards during the early modern age. So it's fascinating how literally the territory of an adventurer, right, as the Kusi really was, would simply turn into at some point the most powerful entity in Northern Ireland, and remain as recognized as such, and with this deep connection, at least nominally, with the English crown prerogatives. All right, we will get a bit more often, if you like, in depth to Irish history, looking at different polities than this one, hopefully soon, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.